Welcome to Pack Talk Podcast, episode 151. And today I'm talking about a topic that's been coming up recently to me in particular and my team. We get a lot of phone calls with people asking about training, and they tell us, the trainers that they're looking at or that they've spoken with or that they've used in the past. And if you're in the dog training world or you're looking into the dog training world, which you are because you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, there's essentially two extremes, right? You've got the purely positive, also known as force-free training. Then you have the compulsion-based training, which is essentially, obviously, if you have a purely positive trainer, they claim that they're using only positive reinforcement. I'll kind of go into that a little bit today. But then you have the compulsion-based trainer, which is using, corrections, punishment. They don't use rewards. They might say they do, but they really don't. And so a compulsion-based trainer, they might be using a leash and a collar. They might be using an e-collar. They might be using the combination of leash and collar and an e-collar. But this keeps coming up, so I think it's important to talk about it and kind of give you what's really happening with these training methods, these training styles, versus what's happening with the kind of the top tier trainers, which are going to be your balance trainers like us. There's a bunch of good balance trainers out there throughout the entire world. We specifically do rewards-based balance training, which I'll talk about a little bit as we progress here. But we'll talk about the extremes, the purely positive, the compulsion. We'll talk about balance trainers. I'll give you some things to be thinking about or things to consider when you're looking into training and how to identify certain things with different people whenever you're talking to trainers. And we're going to try to not go off on a tangent on some of this while I'm talking about it. And I do have unique insight into this subject in particular because whenever I first started training, I was, and I hate to say this, but it is the truth, I was a compulsion-based trainer. That's how I started training. So I have a unique perspective into this topic and both sides of the coin. And it's when I was exposed to rewards-based balance training that I realized what I was doing is wrong. All right, so diving in here, it's, a lot of people call this the war between dog trainers. You got the purely positive and the compulsion-based that are basically at each other's throats all the time. So let's talk about first the truth about positive-only training. Now, positive reinforcement is a powerful tool, and I do believe that everyone should be doing this with their dogs. And we'll talk about all of the different kind of reinforcements that you could use as we keep talking here. But right now, when we focus on positive reinforcement, it's a very powerful tool, and I do believe that you should be doing it with your dog and that trainers should be doing it with dogs. And it's basically, you're rewarding a behavior typically with a food reward, right? And if you reward a behavior, that behavior is going to be more likely to occur again and again in the future, which is what we want, right? That's how science works. No one here is saying that that doesn't work. It's not what we should be doing. But there are limitations when it comes to the purely positive trainer, right? So first of all, I've got a couple of main points I just wanted to discuss about purely positive trainers and what they say. And just to be clear, I have attempted to have purely positive trainers that have reached out to me. I've attempted to have them on the podcast to talk about this. And some of them have said, yes, let's do it. And then as soon as we get to scheduling the podcast, they cut all communication. So if you're a purely positive trainer and you're open to having a discussion with me, let's do it. Reach out to me. All right. So first, purely positive trainers, they lean heavily on managing the environment. They want you, like if you're working with your dog, they want you to cross the street. They want you to avoid the trigger. They want you to, essentially treat your dog, reward your dog before the dog reacts. And, all of those points can be beneficial for a dog's training at a certain point in training. But you don't want to be stuck doing that the whole dog's life, right? You want to progress to where you don't have to walk across the street. You don't have to avoid the trigger, right? You don't have to reward all of the time. And you do have to be careful about your reward timing, because if you do reward the dog before they react, for example, but you're actually rewarding the dog for escalating their behavior, you're actually making that, like, let's just say it's a reactive behavior, you're actually making the reactive behavior more likely to continue to occur with the dog. So it's just something you want to pay attention to, right? There's also things that you can't manage that come up in life. So like if the purely positive trainer wants to manage the environment, right, you can't manage the environment for the entire dog's life. You've got off-leash dogs running up to your dog. You've got kids dropping food. You've got cars pulling down streets quickly, right? I've heard of people that do purely positive training where their dogs are constantly fighting each other. You know, that's going to happen. You can't manage that forever. So this is, you know, one of the things about purely positive training that just doesn't work long term. Again, some of these tactics are useful in the short term, but not in the long term. The next thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to purely positive training, where there's generally a failure, is when there's high arousal. So if your dog has a prey drive, which all dogs do, there's just different levels of prey drive. But let's say your dog has a higher prey drive and your dog wants to chase a squirrel, right? When your dog hits high arousal, your purely positive techniques are most likely not going to be efficient in that specific situation, right? They're not going to work in that situation. If you have a reactive dog or a frustrated dog, those dogs are hitting, boom, they're hitting high arousal. When they enter those mindsets, your purely positive techniques are most likely not going to be working. So when you're at this level, right, as you're progressing your dog's training and you're trying to make training better and better and better, when your dog hits this high arousal, you need some other communication method, some other communication style to communicate to your dog to kind of get out of that high arousal or to redirect them from high arousal. And this is a part of training where purely positive methods just are not going to be as effective as other methods, if they'll even work at all. And the third thing I want to talk about when it comes to purely positive training is how, you know, they resist saying no to the dog, right? This is a big thing. I'm not sure exactly how they phrase it, but essentially, bottom line, they don't want to tell a dog no. And that's essentially telling a dog that they have no boundaries, right? So we all need boundaries. Dogs need boundaries. If we don't have boundaries, it's a free-for-all. And there's a lot of people and a lot of dogs that make bad decisions. And if there's no boundaries, we'll just keep making bad decisions, right? So we have to understand that dogs are social animals. Dogs do understand boundaries. And if you look at like a litter, right, which we've done videos with breeders who have a litter that have us out to assess their litter. But if you look at a litter, right, you've got a mother. And the mother will correct a puppy that's biting too hard. They will correct a puppy that kind of steps over the boundary that the mother has instilled. And that's not abuse, right? That's communication. That's natural in the dog world. So for example, let's say you have a busy street by your house. Your dog is running toward the busy street. And if you're positive only or purely positive trainer, you know, what are you supposed to do in that situation? Your dog's in high arousal, it's running toward a street. It's not returning when you say come, right? Because the arousal is too high. What, are you going to wave a treat in the air and expect your dog to turn around? That's not going to happen. So we need boundaries to communicate to our dog, like this street example. My dog's moving away from me toward this street. If I say come and you don't turn around and come back to me, that is a boundary. Like if I ask you to come, you do have to come, right? So that's a boundary we have to uphold. And let's say you're a purely positive trainer or you're purely positive training. If you don't say no, it doesn't make your training more humane, right? It makes the dog less safe. Just like the street example, the dog's running toward the street. If I can't say no, if I can't communicate to the dog not to do that, it's not more humane. It's actually less safe for the dog. So I want you to, if you're looking into dog training, like I said, or you're in the dog training world, you got to think about it from this perspective, right? Remember that teaching a boundary to your dog, teaching a boundary is a fair and clear communication when it's appropriate in your training progression, right? It's one of the best things you can do for your dog because it keeps your dog safe and it gives them the freedom to be a dog. I don't know the statistics for this, but I'm assuming that a lot of purely positive trainers or purely positive people in training, they don't let their dogs off leash because they can't communicate to their dogs to return to them whenever they're supposed to. And they can't communicate to their dogs to do things that are safe, right? For example, if you're hiking with your dog and you had it off leash and there's a venomous snake, right, that could kill your dog, but you see it, your dog doesn't. You tell your dog to come, they don't come, boom, they get bit by the snake. That was because the dog didn't have a communication method. It didn't have a boundary that you could instill to ensure that dog does come to you whenever you say come, and thus giving the dog safe freedom wherever you go. So that's just something to think about. Now, with that being said, this is a good point right here. There are a bunch of dogs out there that they don't need a lot of additional communication. If you go through all the steps of training like a purely positive trainer would and do that enough times, there are dogs out there that will respond to that appropriately and fine, right? Because every dog's an individual. Some respond differently to different things, right? Some have different backgrounds, different genetics. So there are dogs that will respond relatively good to the training and the communication from the purely positive only, and that'll be okay for most situations. But the majority of the dogs are not like that, okay? So don't just assume that your dog is roped up into that, right? And the last thing I want to talk about with purely positive only trainers is that they claim they're positive only, but they actually end up using other quadrants of operant conditioning, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and I've talked about before. They actually are using other quadrants, but they don't want to admit it, right? So if I'm a purely positive only trainer, essentially what I'm doing is only rewarding the dog. That's all I'm doing, right? Positive reinforcement is I'm giving the dog a reward. That could be petting them, that could be food reward, that could be toy, whatever, right? So if I do anything other than that, I'm using other quadrants. So for example, if a purely positive trainer is trying to train a dog and ever withholds food from the dog, let's say they have a food in their hand and they're training with the dog and they're giving the dog food, but at some point they decide to withhold food from the dog, that's technically another quadrant of operant conditioning. That's called negative punishment, right? So they're actually exiting positive only, right? So just be aware of that. If they ever have a dog like in its crate, for example, when there's other things going on, that's could be considered negative punishment as well. If there's ever a tight leash with a dog that's purely being trained under purely positive only, a tight leash could be negative reinforcement depending on the context. So just understand that positive only definitely has its limits, right? And before you are like, okay, I'm cutting off positive only, before you go on to that tangent, let's talk about the far other extreme, which is compulsion only, which honestly, if I were to choose between the two, I would rather you do positive only training versus compulsion training. So there's a lot of problems with compulsion-based training. Compulsion training, it's sometimes, again, these are like slang words that are used for it. Escape and avoidance training, yank and crank training. These are all terms you might hear when it comes to compulsion-based training. But basically what a compulsion-based trainer is doing is they are forcing the dog into compliance through pressure or correction. If the dog doesn't obey, because the dog doesn't understand what you're asking them to do, because you don't teach them, you just start correcting them, or you teach them with correction. So the dog doesn't obey because they don't understand. They get corrected. They start learning to avoid the discomfort. So that's how they learn to perform the behavior. I don't believe in this approach at all. It's old school. It's lazy. It lacks integrity. Again, like I said, and I hate to say this, but it is the truth. I have a unique insight because that is how I started off in the dog training world. I didn't know any better, right? This was back in 2016. I didn't know any better when I started dog training. I just saw trainers appearing to get things done. I'm like, I want to train dogs. So I start learning from compulsion-based trainers. A couple months go by. I'm like, this isn't right. Doesn't feel right. Feels like there's a better way to do this. And so that's whenever I got introduced to balance training, and I immediately made the switch. So one of the things that comes up with compulsion-based training is learned helplessness. All right, learned helplessness is when a dog doesn't know how to essentially escape or avoid the pressure, and so they go into a learned helplessness state where it's like a very stressed out state, essentially shutting down. Obviously a very bad point to compulsion-based training. We don't want this to happen. So just understand that does happen with compulsion-based training. And for example, this could be someone at their house that's doing this. They don't even know what they're doing. But let's say their dog's pottying in the house. They're tired of their dog pottying in the house. So they come home, they grab their dog's head, they start shoving it in the potty. You know, grabbing the dog's head, shoving it into the potty is a form of pressure. As time goes on, the dog becomes, associated to that person that's grabbing their head and shoving it into the potty. They become learned helpless around that person, right? So it can have that kind of context as well. And while I'm talking about that, there's different kinds of pressure. There's leash pressure, there's e-collar pressure, there's social pressure, right? So any types of these pressures could be applied to the dog and could induce excessive stress. It could be compulsion-based, so just keep that in mind. The other thing that comes up when you're talking about compulsion-based training, especially when we're talking about behavioral modification for a reactive dog or a insecure dog or a dominant dog, right? Compulsion-based training, the way it works, applying pressure, applying correction, basically trying to suppress that behavior. That's what they're doing. They're suppressing the behavior. They're not fixing the root cause, right? So a dog may learn to not react around a particular person because they know that that person will essentially correct them, right? So they'll start suppressing their behavior around that person. They go to a different person who's not correcting them at the level as the other person, and they'll start performing that behavior again, right? We're not really addressing the root cause of that reactivity, whether it's, nervousness, insecurity, dominance, anxiety, whatever it is. That takes more time. Compulsion-based trainers, they don't want to spend a lot of time on something. They want to essentially do it very quickly, right, to move on to the next thing. So just keep that in mind. Another thing that's improper about compulsion-based training is the relationship. Purely positive, they're rewarding a lot. There is going to be a relationship there. Compulsion-based trainers, they're essentially correcting, adding pressure. The time that they spend with the dog or by applying some boundaries, they will have relationship with some dogs, right? This is why compulsion-based trainers are still around, as far as like the pet training world goes. Because some dogs will perform with compulsion-based training, and the appearance of a relationship is there, this training style is still around because people are getting fooled by it, right? Because it appears to be working in some cases, other cases it doesn't appear to be working. So the relationship between the dog and the trainer or the person executing the compulsion-based trainer, that is a factor to consider as well. So what are some ways you could identify a compulsion-based trainer? First of all, if you're talking about a dog trainer doing compulsion-based training, you want to look at the program length of their board and train. So 2 weeks, that's an immediate red flag, especially if they're doing e-collar work in that 2 weeks. Now, with that being said, there are trainers out there that do a 2-week program that just don't accomplish as much as, other trainers do. They may or may not be compulsion-based, right? But if you see a 2-week program where they're using e-collar, they're doing corrections, that's most likely a compulsion-based trainer. That's a red flag. If it's less than 2 weeks, even more of a concern. I see these trainers now popping up where I'm doing a 1-week program with e-collar training. That is a compulsion-based trainer. That's a red flag. If I see a trainer using the e-collar on the first day of training, that's a red flag, right? Look at videos, right? How are they rewarding dogs? Some of the compulsion-based trainers are getting smart, right? They understand the awareness that's going on, so they'll start wearing bait bags and make it seem like they're rewarding dogs with food rewards when they're really not. A lot of times what you'll see compulsion-based trainers doing in their videos or in their training is little pats on the, patting the dog, little pets on the dog, right? and they do this for the human element, it's not really a reward for the dog. They might pet it on the head, give it a kiss on its nose, act like they're talking sweet to the dog. Really what's going on is they're applying the pressure to the dog, and they're doing that for the humans that are paying attention to not be so aversive to what their training style is, right? But the program length is a big indicator. The way that they're rewarding the dog is an indicator. I hesitate to say rewarding because all they're doing is they're just trying to play on the humans that are watching. E-collar, right? If they're using e-collar on day one, they're doing a 1 week or a 2 week program with the e-collar incorporated in that short of a time frame. Red flag, right? Because you got to understand, like, let's say you send your dog to a board and train program, there is a decompression period. Just like if you were to get your dog from a rescue or something like that, there's a decompression period. That's going to be a couple days, right, of the dog getting used to the new environment, starting to build a relationship with that trainer. So these are things you have to think about. If I'm doing a 1 week training program, where's the decompression phase? Where's the relationship phase? Not there. Now, there are particular dogs that would do okay with 1 week, but probably still not in their best interest to get the e-collar done in that 1 week. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to identify potential trainers that you may be looking at, or if you work for someone and this is ringing a lot of bells, maybe it's awakening you to understanding what's really going on. So let's talk about balance training real quick. So we've talked about, very briefly. I could go off on I could have long discussions about these things, right? But I try to keep it brief and to the point. So we've talked about the purely positive side. We've talked about the compulsion-based side. Let's talk about the balance training, okay? Balance training, the quick and easy. This is the best training for your dog. However, there are a lot of balance trainers that will lean heavy on compulsion. So you even if someone's calling themselves a balance trainer, you need to be careful. They'll say that they do rewards-based balance training. They say that they do balance training, but their programs are still 2 weeks. Their programs are still 1 week. That's still a red flag. There's balance trainers that are going to lean into compulsion because it's easier for them to do. They can do that a lot faster than repetitions of rewarding and then slowly getting the dog used to training. They can just start correcting, get the dog to perform to a certain degree, and then move on from there, right? But real balance training is going to be using 4 quadrants of operant conditioning, right? And operant conditioning is the science of how behavior is learned. There's 4 quadrants to it. There's positive reinforcement, there's negative reinforcement, there's positive punishment, and there's negative punishment. Now, when we talk about operant conditioning, this is the tricky part, and I don't know why, B.F. Skinner is the father of operant conditioning. I don't know why they named it like this because it does make it confusing, right? But the terms positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment in operant conditioning, some of them sound harsh, but they're not really harsh. You have to understand them in the context of operant conditioning. So if in operant conditioning, if we say the word positive, that means that we're adding something. If we say the word negative, it means that we are removing something. If we say reinforcement, that means a behavior is more likely to occur in the future. If we say punishment, it means a behavior is less likely to occur in the future. So the 4 quadrants: positive reinforcement, positive, I'm adding something; reinforcement, the behavior becomes more likely to occur in the future. So for example, I ask a dog to sit, the dog sits. I say good, I give it a reward. I've added a reward to make the behavior of sitting more likely to occur in the future, right? Negative reinforcement, I have to remove something to make a behavior more likely to occur in the future. When you're doing negative reinforcement, this is the escape part of escape and avoidance training. But when you're doing negative reinforcement, generally you're gonna apply a little bit of pressure. So for sitting, you would just tighten down the leash a little bit. The dog would sit, right? Ideally, before you ever do this, you've taught the dog how to sit through positive reinforcement and luring. But compulsion-based trainers aren't going to do that, so they're just going to start tightening down the leash and waiting for the dog to sit. When the dog sits, they let go of the leash, right? So the tightening of the leash is applying some pressure to the dog. The dog sits, for example. The leash is slackened, so there's no more tension or pressure on the dog. That is the removal part. That's the negative part. That's the removal part of this situation, of this quadrant. The reinforcement is I remove something, so I've removed the leash pressure. That makes the sitting more likely to occur in the future, right? That's the science behind it. But what compulsion-based trainers do, instead of like doing prerequisite work before using negative reinforcement, they just jump right to that, right? So the dog doesn't have any context or understanding of what to do. So they start getting pressure applied, right? Then they start to stress out. Then eventually they start to figure out what to do to alleviate that pressure. And that makes the behavior more likely to occur in the future, right? So that's kind of the quick and easy on that one. Positive punishment. Positive, remember the next quadrant. Remember, positive is that we add something. Punishment is something that makes a behavior less likely to occur in the future. So positive punishment would be like you're tugging and releasing on the dog's leash, or you give a bump on an e-collar. You're essentially adding in a correction. In dog training terminology, you add in a correction. You add that correction. The correction makes the behavior of whatever was happening less likely to occur in the future. So let's say you ask the dog to sit. Dog does not sit. So you say no. You tug and release on the leash. Leash correction. Now the dog sits. So positive, you added in a correction. And punishment, you made the behavior of not sitting less likely to occur, right? So those are the three quadrants we've gone through so far. The last quadrant, negative punishment. Negative means I remove something. Punishment means that it makes a behavior less likely to occur in the future. So let's say, for example, I'm training with my dog. I have some food rewards, and I'm luring the dog, and the dog does not sit whenever I lure it into a sit. So I take the food reward, I put it behind my back. I have removed the food reward. That's the negative part. And the punishment part is I have, made the behavior of not sitting less likely to occur because I've removed what the dog wants. So I remove it, the dog sits, and I say, good, I give him the reward. So that's the quick and easy on negative punishment. With that being said, if out of those four quadrants, the compulsion-based trainer is using negative reinforcement and positive punishment, the two quadrants that would be used with some type of pressure, right? The positive-only trainer is using one quadrant, positive reinforcement. At least that's what they claim. Balanced dog training will use all four quadrants systematically in a way that's beneficial to the dog, in a way that's fair to the dog, right? Because you do want your dog to understand how to respond to all four quadrants when you do it properly. So first of all, in balance training, rewards are building the behavior, but boundaries are proofing it. So rewards, if I'm training my dog, let's just say I'm working on obedience, for example, sitting, downing. I'm luring them with that, with a piece of food in my hand. They do that behavior. I say, good, I reward them. I'm establishing behavior. I'm building behavior through rewards, right? Now, when my dog understands that behavior, only when they understand, then it's fair to start incorporating and teaching my dog about corrections. It's not like you just start correcting your dog, with a leash, for example, tug and release on the leash for a leash correction. It's not like you just start correcting your dog out of nowhere. You've taught them what the expectation is through positive reinforcement. You could use some negative punishment, which is withholding rewards. And then if they're, that's what you're doing to build up the behavior. And then once they understand, now it's fair to start teaching corrections. Corrections are going to be either negative reinforcement or positive punishment. So let's just say you give a leash correction and the dog then does the behavior it's supposed to do. Then you reward your dog for doing that behavior to teach your dog and communicate to them that, hey, when you feel this correction, this is what you do. When you do what you're supposed to be doing, you still get the reward, right? So that takes time. That takes a lot of time, depending on the dog, depending on the individual. And a lot of compulsion-based trainers, they don't want to spend the time doing that, right? They want to take the lazy way. They don't want to have integrity in their training. So that's something you got to watch out for, right? So, but the balance trainer, they're going through all those steps. The real balance trainer, the proper balance trainer, they're going through all those steps. They're teaching all of that to their dog. They're being fair to the dog. And this is how you build a dog that knows how to make good decisions. This is how you build a dog that really understands and really performs under distraction and has the freedom to be a dog, right? So that's kind of the quick and easy on balance training, why it works, right? So let's talk about some just some simple examples and talk about how the different training methodologies would, work for this specific example. So first of all, for leash reactivity, let's say you have a dog pulling on the leash, right? That's barking at other things on the leash. When this is happening, a purely positive trainer, they might tell you, hey, you need to get further away from the distraction. Increase your threshold, which thresholds are very valid. It is something that you need to do, right? But how are you going to reduce that threshold as time goes on, right? Let's say your dog does react. What do you do in that situation? Purely positive, probably just stay away. Stay away from the distraction. Don't get closer, right? Compulsion-based training, they're just going to, every time the dog reacts, they're just going to start correcting. They're not going to do threshold work. They're not going to, work on eye contact. They're not going to reward the dog for making good decisions. They're looking for that dog to do a behavior that we don't want, and then they're going to hammer that dog with corrections, right? Not cool, not good to go. I would rather you do the purely positive versus the compulsion style for that example. Now, the balance trainer. The real balance trainer. Remember I said there's balance trainers that lean heavily towards compulsion-based training, right? Keep that in mind as we're talking here and what you're thinking about, with all the training experience that you have and what you've looked into with training. But a real balance trainer that's dealing with leash reactivity, they're going to start with building focus and engagement. They're going to take the dog ideally to a neutral place. They're not going to worry about addressing the reactivity first. They're going to worry about teaching the dog, right? Teaching the dog what to do. Teaching the dog how to make good decisions. They will get to the reactivity. That'll take more time to get there. But whenever they get to working on that reactivity and focusing on it, the dog will be better by the time they get there. So what they focus on is focus and engagement first before ever getting to a trigger. Then they teach the dog how to respond to the leash. Right? Leash pressure training. Then they teach the dog obedience, right? Sit, down, heel, walking on your side with a loose leash, come command, stay command, place command, how to have impulse control, how to have self-control. All this takes time. All this takes a ton of time, depending on the dog, right? Some dogs progress faster than others. Once they do all of that, and the dog understands, all these behaviors, then they work on accountability. Teaching the dog, hey, if you know the behavior, I've taught you the behavior, I've spent all the time teaching you, and you still decide to perform or not perform a behavior when you're asked, you get a correction, right? So they teach with the leash correction. Then they'll do e-collar conditioning if they're using the e-collar. Then they'll go out and they'll start proofing with triggers, prior triggers or distractions, right? So that is when it's fair to start working on that. It's fair to start correcting the dog, and they won't just correct the dog. They'll generally correct the dog for stepping out of boundary, right, for reacting. They'll balance their threshold, and they'll reward the dog for making a good decision. So all those are the things that are going on with the balance trainer, right, that are working on leash reactivity. Let's talk about another example, jumping on guests. Right, so let's just say, for example, you got a dog jumping on guests, positive only trainer. They're going to say, ignore the jumping, reward when all four paws are on the ground, right? Get your dog used to sitting, right? All these kind of things. But at a certain point, you can only do so much in a purely positive sense. At a certain point, depending on your dog's just going to start blowing you off because jumping is fun, right? It feels good to jump on people. And you've got some inconsistencies there, because if your dog jumps up on some people, they may inadvertently reward your dog by saying, oh, good boy, right, petting them, whatever. Even when you're saying, hey, don't pet them, right? It's just something to think about. The compulsion-based trainer, they're going to immediately apply a correction. In this case, it might be just kneeing the dog, hitting the dog, kicking the dog, taking a leash and cracking the dog with the leash. Heavy e-collar correction, all these options, right? That's your compulsion-based training. The balance trainer, they are going to reward your dog for keeping all four paws on the ground. They might step back. They're going to do a lot of the stuff that the positive-only trainer is doing for a period of time. And once they understand that the dog understands the gist of the foundational parts of that behavior, then they will probably start applying correction for, stepping out of boundary. So if the balance trainer spends time making sure the dog knows to not jump on people, it knows to keep all four paws on the ground, it knows to sit in order to get pet, but then it chooses to jump, now the balance trainer will correct the dog, and the dog will come off of the person that it's jumping on because it understands the correction clearly, and then it might get rewarded again, right? So something to think about with the balance trainer. Last scenario I wanted to talk about real quick, off-leash recall, right? Off-leash recall. How do you accomplish this? Positive only trainer, they may not take their dog off leash. They may not give their dog that off leash freedom, right? Because if their dog chases something at full speed, if you're positive only, you're not going to stop that, right? Compulsion-based training for off leash, they'll do two things generally. First of all, they'll just make sure that they have a long line on the dog when they're doing their off leash training. And if they say come and the dog doesn't come, they're just going to grab that line and give a big old leash correction, right? They haven't taught this to the dog before. This is how they teach it. Grab it, give a big old leash correction, and then they'll do that enough times to where they feel good about when they say come, the dog coming, even at a distance from them. Most compulsion-based trainers are going to be using e-collars for this. So the dog, moves away from them. They say come, dog doesn't come, boom, e-collar correction, heavy level, right? They'll do that until the dog is reliably not running away and will come back when the e-collar is used, right? Balance trainer, what's the balance trainer doing? Again, I'm not going to go through all the steps again, but engagement, teaching the behavior, through rewards, applying some corrections for the behavior, doing e-collar conditioning, making sure the dog understands the e-collar fairly and concisely, then doing long line work where the dog gets to move away from them. They call them back to them. If the dog doesn't come, they will ping him with an e-collar, then say come, make sure the dog comes back, reward the dog for coming back, repetition, lots of repetitions of this. And then they'll go fully off leash with the dog with the e-collar, and everything will be understood very clearly by the dog, and the dog will be, adhering properly. That's how you train, right? That's the proper way to do that. You can see both sides of the coin here when it comes to this stuff, right? What are some common balance training myths? So some people will say, usually purely positive people will say that balance training makes dogs fearful and aggressive, right? That's not true if you have a real balance trainer, because a real balance trainer is using all four quadrants systematically and progressively for the dog at hand, right? Now, some dogs are more nervous than others. Some dogs are more insecure than others. Some dogs have a strong history of aggression, right? So it's not the balance training that's affecting that. It's that reinforcement from years of practicing aggression to where, the dog still wants to try and practice that sometimes. The second myth that some people bring up about balance training is that balance training is just an excuse to use harsh methods. That's not true. Balance trainers are scientifically, right, systematically, progressively training the dog to ensure the behaviors are solid. And if the dog does step out of a boundary, that the communication method used, let's just say an e-collar communication, for example, the dog does respond appropriately to that and does what it's supposed to do at the time, right? The third myth that a lot of people bring up about balance training, e-collars and prong collars are torture devices. And that's not true. Obviously, any training tool could be misused, and it's the compulsion-based trainers that are usually giving balance dog trainers, a bad rap, because people consider compulsion-based trainers to be balance trainers. They consider balance trainers to be compulsion-based trainers. They don't really understand the difference between the two, especially with a lot of compulsion-based trainers trying to act like they're balance trainers so that they can get more clients and work with more people, and get people to pay them, right? Which is shocking to me that some of these compulsion-based trainers are still out there and people are paying them, right? That's a problem. But usually they're the ones that are giving tools like e-collars and prong collars a bad name, right? And then they give balance trainers a bad name. Anybody using that tool is bad, right? So just keep that in mind. So I know I just kind of went off on a long tangent, but here's actually, some of the key points to remember. One, positive reinforcement is essential. It builds the behavior, it builds the relationship, it builds your dog's confidence. Never skip this step. Now, with that being said, you have to understand reinforcement schedules, and this is I'm not trying to go off on a whole nother tangent, but people think that when you're rewarding a dog, that's all you're ever doing. That's all you're ever doing. No. As time goes on in training, you have to reduce your reinforcement schedule. So at the beginning of training, you're rewarding a lot, you're reinforcing a lot. As training goes on, you're going to slowly start reducing the amount of rewards that you're using. And long term, you just want to be on a random reinforcement schedule to where you're just randomly rewarding the dog, right? Another point to remember, corrections are not cruel when they are fair. And fair means that the dog has been taught the behavior, the dog understands the behavior, and the correction is clear and proportionate to what's going on at the time. I always say use the lowest, most effective correction for your dog in the situation. And if you're using an e-collar, sometimes that means you have to turn the level up on your e-collar, depending on what's going on around you. Sometimes that means you have to turn the level down on the e-collar. Your e-collar level will never be one level. It'll go up, it'll go down based on the situation at hand. Same thing with your leash corrections. You might have to you might have to give a pop and release on the leash at a certain, pressure. For one situation, you might have to pop harder, pop lighter in different situations depending on what's going on. Remember that the goal for your dog, most of us have pet dogs. We want our dogs to be a companion. We want them to work with us. We don't want them to be bribed to do stuff for us all the time like positive only training does. And we don't want to, correct them so much and just be compulsion based so that they just are afraid to step out of line, right? We don't want those two extremes. We want it balanced. Balanced dog training for your family pet means your dog gets real freedom. They get to go to the park. They get to meet and play with other dogs if that's suitable for them. They get to walk past distractions, all because you've given them the structure to handle that. When you're looking at dog training, if you're a dog trainer, take this into consideration. Make sure that you're really vetting the trainer you're working with. Make sure you understand what their training philosophy is. You can ask them, what quadrants of operant conditioning are you using? Tell me about your background in training. Why is your training program 2 weeks long when this training program is 6 weeks long, for example? Depending on the company, if it's a franchise, there's a lot of franchises across the country in the United States. I know some of you guys are listening from other places. There's a lot of franchises out there. So tell me about your training process with your franchise, right? You can usually go to the franchise website and see their process. If it's a 2-week training course, a 1-month training course, those are all red flags, right? But for us at Canine Revolution Dog Training, our system is a rewards-based balance system. I've talked about our entire progression on other podcasts. You can check them out on our channel. But the balanced approach that we use, it's based on relationship. It's based on education for the dog and the owner. It's based on clear communication. And if you guys want to work with our team, all you got to do is go down to the link in the description, reach out to us, let us know you're interested in working with us. We work with people from all over the United States in our board and train programs, and we work with people around the world in our virtual training programs. But let us know if you're interested, Canine Revolution Dog Training. We also have Canine Revolution apparel, so if you want to support the podcast, support yourself, you can get you a Good to Go shirt, Good to Go hoodie, Good to Go beanie, Canine Revolution shirt. There's a bunch of different things on there. If you're watching the video version on YouTube on the Canine Revolution Dog Training channel, you might see some chickens behind me at points in the video. You might see guinea fowl behind me. You might see some ducks behind me. We've got guinea fowl shirts. We've got chicken shirts on the store. If you're wanting to train your dog yourself, I wrote a book. It's called The Ultimate Leash Training Manual. It's available on Amazon. You can check that out. That is basically giving you everything that we do to develop a well-behaved dog in a balanced way You can grab that book on Amazon. I believe it's $10, and you'll be good to go. You can finish reading that book relatively quickly, immediately start applying the principles, and immediately start seeing results. If you're looking for a great gift for yourself, for your kids, for someone that you know, you can go on Amazon as well, get the I Love Dogs coloring book. All these links are in the description below. If you want to feed your dog the optimal diet, that's going to be a raw diet, you can go to wefeedraw.com, use the discount code Canine-Revolution50, all spelt out, Canine-Revolution50. That'll get you 50% off your first box. And raw diets are more expensive than kibble diets. So if you're trying to balance your budget, you can feed a kibble base with a raw topper to help get your dog as much nutrient density and quality as possible, right, while being good for the budget. One of our affiliates, Canine Super Supplements, they are now owned by Raw and Paw Company. So if you go to rawandpawcompany.com, the link's in the description below. The Canine Super Supplements is now a supplement line of Raw and Paw Company. But there's other supplements that Raw and Paw Company has as well, and they have raw food too. So you can go to the Raw and Paw Company website. You can check all of that out. Canine Super Supplements line is one of the top tier dog supplement lines. They've got joint support formulas. They've got puppy formulas. They've got multivitamin, weight gainer formulas. They got a ton of stuff on there. Check it out. You won't be disappointed. And you can use the discount code Canine Revolution for 10% off of your order. We're also partnered with Monster Canine Toys on Amazon, and they have a website. You can use the discount code Canine Revolution on Amazon or their website, but they have some of the best dog toys you could find, and they do have a guarantee, which I love. If your dog destroys it, they will replace it, right? So check out Monster Canine Toys for some hardcore toys for your dog. If you have a dog that's torn up every other toy, check out Monster Canine Toys. Try some of those toys out. Last but not least, to optimize your performance, we're affiliated with Jocko Fuel. That's going to be jockofuel.com. You can get the clean energy drinks. You can get the protein powders. You can get the creatine. You can get the fish oil. All those kind of things are on jockofuel.com. Discount code Canine-Revolution for 10% off. All right? So with that being said, if this episode helped you out, if it's bringing some things to mind, please leave us a comment on the YouTube video of what you're thinking, of what your thoughts are. Please rate us and review us on your favorite podcast platform. That really does help us, and we love reading every review and every comment, and we try to reply to as many as we can. So let me know if you guys have questions. Let me know what you want to hear on upcoming podcasts, what you like, what you don't like. And until next time, this is Pack Talk Podcast.